Welcome back to the Bigwater podcast. We've got a guest that goes way back, nearly 25 years, a guy that helped me early in the days of the fishing career, Dave Csanda, more than 30 years as one of the head guys at In-Fisherman with the Al and the whole group of the Lindners there. Dave does not pull any punches either. He talks about the good times, the bad times, some fun stuff, and a crazy story about being basically banned from a Canadian airport. I think you're going to want to hear the rest on the Bigwater podcast this week. Producer dude, here we are again, the Bigwater podcast. People are liking us. We're hearing about this. You have anybody stop you? Because they stopped me at the gas station and say, hey, I saw so-and-so on there.
Only that day where I was late and they asked if I was producer dude. That's the only time.
And you got called out, dude. I could not have asked for anything better than to have a couple of random strangers. And they looked a little like they could take care of some business too.
Yeah.
So that was a little scary for a minute. But we have... and we've said this before several times because I feel like we've brought it with our guests. I mean, we've had some true, the L word, and not loser, legends. And I hear that with kids all the time. Like, do your kids ever say that? Like, oh, that's legendary. Or
they use GOAT.
GOAT. Okay, GOAT. Yes. There you go. Yeah, that would maybe be the Tom Brady more appropriate. But I hear that all the time, and I'm kind of like, this guy's been doing this like 5 years. The guy's like, he's 25 years old. Like, you're not a legend. You're not the GOAT. But we have Dave Csanda, one of the original guys from In-Fisherman, one of the guys that helped form In-Fisherman magazine and the Professional Walleye Trail, Walleye In-sider magazine, on and on and on. Like, this guy is a legend, nearly 50 years in the business, and he calls it like it is, and he's a lot calmer than me, thank God. But I cannot wait to hear some of the stuff with Dave because I've been working with him since I was in high school, 25 plus years of doing some stuff with Dave Csanda. And he is a guy that understands. He's a good storyteller, you know, in my opinion. He's kind of like who's a good storyteller, producer dude? Not me.
Good storyteller.
No? Yeah, like Dave Csanda. Dave Sanda's a good storyteller. And we're going to hear him right now. So without making him wait any longer, let's bring on Dave Csanda to the Bigwater podcast. We had to navigate some storms and some technical difficulties and hurricanes, but here we are back together.
Yeah, we had this. Good to see you, Ross. We had this little thing called Hurricane Ian today, crossing across Florida, and I wasn't sure whether you would get me tonight or not. But fortunately for me, it went a little bit south, and the worst winds we got were about 60. Something like that. But Central Florida got really hammered big time in the last 30 hours or so. And it's still probably 35, 40 miles an hour here. And I'm just way out on the fringe. So we're really talking the force of nature big time.
It's amazing on how those things happen. You know, somebody a quarter mile away is spared and somebody a couple hundred yards away is not. So yeah, thoughts with those people. But hopefully by the time this runs, things are cleaned up and everybody's back to so-called normal. But I'll tell you what, we're going to talk about you. I mean, unless they've been living under a rock or maybe they're a very youngster in the game, people should definitely, if they don't know you personally, know what you've done and your game. But people love the stories. And we keep hearing guys say, open her up and get us a story. So I think the one that I remember hearing, and I thought about producer dude here, that's what we call him, that's helping us out. He always says I have too much fishing equipment and too many rods. And I remember you were going to tell me a story and we cut it off so we could hear it here about Ron Lindner and 99 rods. And when producer dude heard that, he said, that sounds like a Ross story. So we're talking about Ron Lindner.
It's not unusual for a good hardcore fisherman to have 99 rods of all different kinds of shapes, but person wouldn't usually take all those in the boat with you at the same time. And the story was, back in the day, Ron Lindner, who I used to work with, was doing a deal with Cabela's. He was going to be their rod tester, and he asked them to send him 99 and all of the rods, every rod that you make. And the guy said, well, Ron, it's got to be 100 rods. He says, I want them all. Send them all. I'm going into Saginaw Lake with Dick Sternberg. We're going to boat in with all the rods, and I'm going to test them over the week's fishing. So, okay. So he goes, he gets all these rods, and he puts them in the car, and then takes them in the boat, like, holding this big bundle of rods, lays them in the boat, and they have to portage into the resort. And they're going in the evening, and they're halfway across the lake, and the Sternberg says, there's this good hump out here. We should fish for walleyes on the way in. So I'm going to pull up on it. You throw out the anchor. So,
oh God.
Yeah.
Oh God.
So Ron threw out the anchor, and 99 of the 101 rods either broke or went overboard. And Ron just looked at it and he says, "Why is it always me?" Well, he had a knack for grand disasters like that. It was nothing against him, but he was like the world's ultimate field tester. So 99 in one shot. That's got to be a record.
I'll tell you what, I'm very fortunate. I haven't broke that many over the years. Mm-hmm. And when it happens, it's usually something oddball. But we've had Al on the podcast, and they always called him the idea man, Ron, the late Ron Lindner. But I think a lot of people that knew him was as Calamity Jane as well.
Yeah, he was a little bit of both. He was an absolutely brilliant inventor type, though. I give him a lot of credit. He came up with a lot of the concepts that were the foundation for In-Fisherman and the whole empire there. The calendar period system, the lake classifications, the fish plus location plus presentation equals success formula. These all came by hook or crook out of the cranium of Ron Lindner somehow. And I give him a lot of credit. He's responsible for millions of fishermen today being able to communicate and understand and catch a lot more fish.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know, and again, we won't turn it into an Al and Ron story, but because we kind of done that. But like the Lindy rig, I mean, so many of those things that came out of that initial deal. But so you're
let me tell you a Lindy rig story before we get going.
Oh, well, I like it.
I fished the Gull Lake fishing opener in Minnesota one time with Al many, many, many years ago, and we were Lindy rigging using live bait rigs, and Al just seemed like he kept going faster and faster and faster, and I kept putting heavier and heavier and heavier sinkers on to try to keep my bait down, and I finally got frustrated, and I said, "Whoever taught you how to Lindy rig?" Well, he and Ronald had invented it, but the point of it was he was trying to move fast to locate some biting fish, and then the point was once he did, then he would slow down and use the tempting nature of that rigging system with live bait to catch a whole bunch more. But first you had to find them. So that's one of the valuable things I learned from him over the years. You got to move quickly to find something. And then when you find it, then you got to pick it apart.
I think it's fair to say anybody that knows me, I'm wired a little bit like Al, and you're probably the one that comes in and just is the cool, calm, collected one of the group. Is that fair?
I'm more the live bait rigger, jigger type, as opposed to the fast open water troller with multiple lines and covering, like a shrimp trawler out there. By nature, I am the person who wants to be more slow and meticulous. But I learned over the years, you got to be able to do both, because you go out with one jig in the middle of Lake Erie, and it's a lonely feeling, like being the Maytag repairman, man. You got to have more efficiency to cover that situation. So you do whatever catch fish.
That's a conversation I have pretty much weekly with people that say, "Hey, when can I come and jig? I want to come in July." And it's like, oof, you're putting the odds against yourself at that point when we can run. I like to call them educated lines, when we can run 3 lines per person now. So having, let's say, 9 lines out there versus 2 or 3 it's a big difference.
Yep.
Just figuring things out and figuring colors and everything out. But one of the stories that somewhere I've got the audio file, and we're going to have to get it up. But I don't know if you remember, it was probably about 12 or 13 years ago. We interviewed you and Al, my buddy Kurt Niedermeyer, when we were doing the walleye trolling book.
Yes.
And we were trying to get excerpts out of that. And one of the funniest things I remember, and I'm paraphrasing and being a little short on this, but Al was like, on Friday we told the Daver, Monday morning we need to do a magazine. I just figure it out. And you were how long in fisherman at that point? I mean, you were barely out of school, I think you told me.
Yeah, I've been out of college for a couple of years when I first went up there. And they decided, that they should do a magazine. And then, like many other things, they said, well, okay, now how are we going to do it? We just promised it to people. How we were already selling subscriptions. How are we going to do it? So we figured it out on the fly. And interesting, in those early days of In-Fisherman, nobody was trained at all in the magazine production concept at all. We had to just kind of figure it out by hook or crook as we were going along. And because we knew the subject matter, the fishing end of things, and we had really good information, we somehow made the rest of it work. We dragged that along behind with us. And little by little, we got better. And one other thing that helped was, I know in my early days, we were out of the office fishing by 2:00 every day. We finally learned, you got to stay in the office. You're going to do a magazine, you got to stay in the office and work and get stuff done and get deadlines done. So there was a happy medium we reached there.
I can definitely relate to that. But I think that in those early days, I mean, not having a structured deal, like you hear this so many times from people, forget fishing for a second, right? Like somebody that's in field ABC or DEF, it doesn't matter what it is, somebody that comes in that just says, I'm going to make this happen and I have passion about it, instead of having this formal training, like musicians, like producer dude, right? I mean, how many, I'm sure you can rattle off somebody that's like an amazing drummer or something, right? That has no training. No, he's back there silent, muted on us. Amazing. But there's so many musicians that have no formal training, right? And you just wonder if would that have been the same if you didn't have that kind of salesy but yet awesome fisherman Al, and then you've got the brains of inventing with Ron, and then you're probably the polisher of these things, and a few of the other early years cronies.
It took a combination of personalities to pull the whole thing off. Yeah, it definitely did. And you had Al was always the front man. Ron would push him out front because he had this charming personality, and obviously all of them could catch fish. All of us were pretty good anglers, but everybody had their own strengths and some had weaknesses. But it all worked together. And it was an outstanding team. And it was, the best way I could describe it. It was, as far as the satisfaction of what we were doing, helping people. It was like being the Chicago Bulls of the Michael Jordan era back in those days for us, because that's how good the team was. It was pretty darn amazing.
It is, just because when you think about it back, like you don't ever really know if something's good until later on, right? And I think now there's so much more out there, and there's so many more people doing it. I tell people all the time that early, whether it's the PWT or In-Fisherman, that helped allow a guy like me to have the job that I have now, 40 years later or whatever that is. And I don't think at the time you can even realize that, but yet you look back now at Al or yourself or a few of those other guys, they're still considered and are really, really good fishermen, even with the new age and all of these people that they've had the test of time. Well,
one thing back in the old days, we didn't necessarily have all the technology that is available today, all of the different electronics and of all different types, and the fancy rods and all the lures and the fine lines, and a lot of the stuff we used would have been kind of crude by modern standards. So you had to do things, the tough way. You had to, when you didn't have, we didn't even have electronics, you had to feel weeds and kind of count your jig down and find the depth and do things manually. And then as the electronics came along, you could move faster and interpret more. And the better things got, the more and more we could really become like real fishing machines, get out there and go through areas and find the fish and then fine-tune the approach to catch them. But today's angler, he's been so spoiled by the internet and all the information and the online shopping and everything. And the temptation is to see what won the last tournament and say, okay, I got to punch the button and buy some of them, and they'll be shipped here in 2 days. That's all I need to go out and catch fish. No, you need a background the information and a knowledge of everything that's going on in a body of water to pick through all of the different things that are going as far as seasons and species preference and bait fish and how are they behaving with the current weather systems, and what does the lake offer them for structure, weeds, rocks, not much structure at all, or is it an abundance of trees? Or you get all of this stuff going in your head, and somehow you manage to process logical circumstances where the fish are probably going to be given that body of water and time of year and the species. And then you start figuring out what it's going to take to catch them. So it's a lot of modern day people want to take the shortcut and jump right to the end. And I'm going to tie this on my lure on my line. You got to start with the background to be successful consistently.
So Ross, I want to stop the podcast for a second.
Whoa.
I know.
Okay.
We'll get back to the guest in a minute. I saw you. I was looking at stuff. I was researching. I was researching for.
Oh my God, you're doing your job. Oh my God,
I'm doing my job, and I was on something called Powder Puff, which I don't know why you were on Powder Puff, but I saw your face on something called Powder Puff or something like that.
Powder Hook, man, powderhook.com.
Okay, well, what is that?
Well, as you kind of found out, we're cheating on a little bit. Normally, the fellow listeners there at Bigwater know that you have to tease me with ice cream to give a fishing report because I quite frankly hate them. But we are doing an extensive fishing report, amongst other things, with powderhook.com. And they've got a bunch of things across Instagram and Facebook and all that good stuff too. But we're doing a detailed fishing report. They're talking about really detailed stuff with what's going on specifically on Lake Erie here in the western and central basins, and even a few times there in the eastern basin in the summer, now through May of 2023. So we're going to be doing lots of stuff, and you already seen some of it because you caught me red-handed, but we've got a perch, information on there. We're talking about planer boards. We've got all kinds of different information, but with myself and then some other Lake Erie studs that basically are teaching how to catch more walleyes, what's going on currently. And I mean, powderhook.com. It's a one-stop shop right now for Lake Erie info, whether it's a fishing report, videos, or some written articles, how to select a charter captain like myself, different things to think about and talk about. So a lot of unique things there, as you already know.
So powderhook.com, that's where we go.
Do you feel when you start using bleach jugs, and now we've got live sonar, like Mega Live, where you can see the fish? I mean, do you think the fish are just a lot smarter than they used to be?
I think a lot of I always used to say the dumb ones, but they wouldn't necessarily be the dumb ones. It would be the ones that are just more aggressive and predisposed to strike, a little bit more aggressively. And you can make a case for whether you have, over the generations, the aggressiveness on some fish has been genetically removed or not. And now the ones that are survivors are maybe not smart, but they are, they're practiced and they're more cautious. That can be possible, I suppose. Although we can still catch fish with aggressive techniques. It all depends on how vulnerable they are and how aggressive they are at the time. I will say this about all of the different things we have at our disposal. My feeling was always that don't stifle the technology. You still got to catch the fish. So, we started with weights and strings, and then we went to green box locators, which helped us go faster. And then we had paper graphs, and then we went to Loran-C and eventually to GPS, and gave us a better view of the lake. And then we had GPS mapping on our screens. We could drive right to a spot, and then we could mark areas and trolling paths, and we kept getting more and more sophisticated. We had underwater cameras for ice fishing, and it kept getting more and more and more. But my feeling was always you can never go too far, and you still got to catch the fish. All this stuff just helps you. Now we have this live sonar stuff, and now I am starting to wonder whether we've actually crossed the threshold on that one. And
Interesting.
People may disagree with that. I remember hearing earlier this year there was a professional muskie trail tournament where of the pairs of anglers, only one boat caught more than 2 muskies, and the boat that won caught like 13 of them in a weekend or something. And they did it by using a live sonar tactic, following drop-offs, marking bigger fish, making many, many, many casts at them, and eventually triggering them. And that raised a point of concern, like, have we gotten to a point where now the technology could possibly be a little too much a little too much.
It's
and I think
funny. Yeah, that's a crazy one that you bring that up, because do you know they banned it in the muskie tours, number one, but number two, that guy that you're talking about, he had won several in a row. And I wasn't there, but as I was told by a buddy who fishes on that muskie tour, he had 4 live sonars. So he had complete coverage around his boat, and he was just drive basically to the fish with the trolling motor, and they were working individual fish. There was like 0 wasted casts. I mean, they were essentially sight fishing,
yes.
even though they're in deeper water.
Yeah, sight fishing in an area where you can't see with your just your eyes or your sunglasses, but it giving you, it's giving you ultra visibility for what's down below. And have we reached the point with that technology that we've gone too far? And I really have to wonder about it. At this point, that technology is still quite expensive, and a lot of people can't afford to use it. But it's got me thinking. For the first time, I'm concerned.
Well, I know when we had, I think it was Al, and we had Matt Johnson from Clam on. I think both of us talked about, you could wipe out like crappies in the wintertime, for example, that people have very difficult time locating in those basins. But now it's just, once you get on them, I mean, people that haven't done that, once you get on them, they're not as picky, but trying to find them, let alone stay on them, is extremely difficult. And with this live sonar stuff, I think a little bit of discretion or sportsmanship might need to be exercised.
Yes, and I think in the future you're going to see regulations come down the pike. And I was never in favor of that, but I think with the new technology, I think things are going to be necessary as far as how far can you go with this stuff, and it's going to be a learning curve.
And when you say regulations, do you mean by the state, or do you mean like during tournaments, or?
I think it could go as far as by state or province. It could. We'll see. We'll have to. It's in its infancy now. We're going to have to see where it goes. Certainly, tournament organizations have much more ability to regulate a short-term event for one species over a couple of days. But, will it go to where a state or a province has to say something about the technology? I don't know. We're all learning together on this one.
Yeah, that's, you would think the more manageable thing might be to just, maybe cut back on limits or some different things like that. But again, you open Pandora's box, because I see it all the time with people, just because they keep their limit of 2, 4, whatever it may be. How many fish did you catch and not handle ethically or responsibly, I guess you could say? And you may have let 30 fish go, but do you essentially give 20, 25 of them a death wish?
Yeah, you catch a bunch of crappies or walleyes in real deep water and bring them up, and toss them back. The survival is going to be very minimal. So, depending on the situation, you have to use some judgment and experience. So, anyway, I don't want to sound like I'm bashing a product, because it is an amazing technology, but it is in its infancy, and we have to learn how far we can take it.
Agree. I think everybody's kind of on that. That's kind of how some of the other guys that we've had on have said it. Nobody's against it per se, but it's one of those, I don't know that we've seen the evil that could potentially be coming from it. But so you were with In-Fisherman for this is the elephant in the room. Like, you helped build that, whether you want to say it or not, for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And how long were you there before the PWT started in its infancy, and how did that really come about?
Let's see. I joined there in the late 1977, and the PWT came about. We had a single tournament in 1989 at Mille Lacs Lake, and then went with the 4-tournament series in 1990, and the year after, and then for many years from that. It came about because we were looking for some kind of a vehicle to promote walleye fishing and try to elevate it to the same level as competitive bass fishing. And the idea was you could not only would need a tournament, but you would need some kind of promotional vehicle like magazines and television and radio, and didn't have podcasts at the time, to take what was learned at the tournaments and get that knowledge out to people. And that's how things would work for everyone, for the anglers to be competing and make money, for us as publishers and TV production people to get leading edge, fast breaking information, and being able to put it out to the public. Obviously, from a selfish standpoint, that would have people watching our TV shows and buying our magazines to see what was going on. So, I mean, it was a two-way street, obviously, and also good for the industry, because we would be promoting walleye tackle and walleye lures and all of these, the boat products and the electronics and things like that for that end of the market, and helping to skyrocket it to the forefront. And so there really was a big boost in walleye fishing, certainly in sophisticated walleye fishing, that accompanied that tournament circuit as it grew.
I mean, I can still remember waiting by the mailbox almost quite literally, to get that Walleye In-sider or to watch that TV show that would come out. And it's just crazy that that was often months after a tournament that you'd see that coverage, right? Or you'd actually see the official place list. And now things are, at a walleye tournament, you've got your wife or girlfriend or sons, daughters, whatever it may be, that are texting you the results because that's already uploaded to the internet. And the same goes with, the TV stuff. I mean, it's on Facebook Live, or these things are uploaded so quickly. I don't think people appreciate, not to sound like a dinosaur here, but even in my lifetime, how quickly this has changed. And like you said earlier about the vehicles that we have now for education, and there's not that 4-month wait.
Yeah, it's instantaneous, and people nowadays, because of the iPhones and everything that they use on computers and stuff, they want and they demand instant information. They don't want to wait for a magazine to come out a lot of the time. Now, the thing is, when you put out a magazine, you can put out a longer and well thought out articles and describe things and do things in much more detail when you've got a little time to think about it and present it, as opposed to really bang it out there quickly electronically. But, there's still room for both. Nowadays I work with Midwest Outdoors, which is a tabloid, hunting, fishing tabloid out of the Chicago area. We cover about 12, 15 states. And we bring a lot of good information that you don't get elsewhere. Yeah, and it's one more vehicle that people can use. So they can read a magazine, and then they can go to a podcast, and they can also watch a television show and go to a seminar and pick up information however you can, and put it all together. It's all good stuff, no matter how you get it. Back in the day, when there was very few people giving seminars and there weren't too many fishing TV shows, you could go to the Chicago Sports Show and you could have well over 1,000 people come to your seminar. And that was nuts. That was nuts. Nowadays, they don't necessarily have to do that. They can watch a lot of things and get their information electronically. So maybe the value of the seminars have gone down somewhat, and people have become more reliant on electronics. But also, if you go to a live performance with somebody, you can ask questions. It's easier to pick somebody's brain after the seminar is over, and it's just a different form of learning. It's all good.
Well, I mean, you just look at the old In-Fisherman. I mean, some of those early pieces were 3,000-4,000 word full length articles, and now it's 800 words at most, 500 to 800 words, and bullet points and these things that are easy to consume on your phone. And you're right, it's like, quick and dirty. And maybe there's, it's clickbait, and there's a lot of these other things in there that's just what people want. And
they've been programmed to get their information in quick bites. And that's because of the electronic age. Back in the day, we could write an entire issue of a magazine it would have 1 or 2 subjects in the magazine. I mean, we're talking 40, 50 pages on a particular thing, really delving into it. It's like reading a textbook. And nowadays, people don't really seem to want that. They want their information in more bite-sized portions that they can read quickly. So times have changed.
Yeah, and like a funny another Ron story that's kind of funny with my old buddies there, Roach and the Foffriches. I can remember when they had a Putin Bay PWT, and they're on an island, of course. We do some ice fishing off there to this day, and it's just funny because someone had got a tip that you needed orange crankbaits. Well, the real tip was you wanted orange on the belly. And you remember that, like old Shad Raps back then it was, or even some Deep Junior Thunder sticks. But you had to have an orange belly, and that plays out even to this day. But but Ron took a bunch of, I think it was roaches and fofriches baits and spray painted the whole thing blaze orange.
Gee, thanks. Yeah.
That made me think. But in all seriousness, the stuff that came about, because back then when I was traveling with like Dave Hansen and Gary Roach as literally a non-driving kid, they were in like 17-foot boats with 75 horses. I think Gary, at that time, Gary had a 19 or 18-foot, like 1875 or 1775, whatever it was, Lund with like a 90-horse tiller. And that was a lot of the field. There was other guys that had some wheel boats and such, and that evolved, but they really changed. The PWT, I think, was without a question changed the face of walleye fishing, because not only tournaments and competitive stuff later on, like, FLW and that, but just the gear we used. Crazy on how that changed. Nobody here had a trailer boat. Nobody.
Now then, over the years, because of what they learned at these tournaments, the boats got bigger, they got faster, bigger motors, more propulsion systems with the kicker motors and the bow mount electrics, and not electrics on the stern, and just they got more and more sophisticated, and they also got more expensive. Unfortunately, nowadays, a tournament grade walleye boat is $100,000 with all of the electronics that it's got, and a boat of a significant size, and that's pretty spendy for a lot of people. But people aspire to that too.
Well, there's so many people, myself included. Like, I learned how to fish spinners in a totally different way. I can remember even going farther back than that, kind of a little before my time of being involved with them. But, Roach coming out here with Jim Foffridge Sr. and saying, "Hey, why aren't you guys fishing on these rock piles?" And they're like, no, we go way out here. And, they were driving it all over those spawning fish on the reefs. And just, it sounds crazy, but nobody was doing that. And old Roacher did the whole jig and minnow trick there and showed Foffridge that. And obviously that's completely changed the way that we do things. But really, that could be said of so many things. Like I started to say with spinners, my buddy Bighead, the late Bighead, he learned as being an amateur on the PWT, watching some of these Minnesota guys kind of adapt what you do back home. And now there's something kind of mixed in the middle, what we do here. And so many tactics got brought from other places that ended up, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. But I think that's what we saw. It's crazy on the things that were developed through those early tournaments.
When I first came out to Erie, 1980, I think it was, fished with Foffridge and a bunch of boys out of Floros, and it was all casting weight forward spinners at the time. That's just the way that people fished. And in 1982, I hooked up with a guy in Wisconsin, and he showed me some of the early planer boards, and we filmed a TV show trolling with little online planers in 82.
And that was row trolling for muskies then, right?
No, it was a walleye show.
That was walleye?
It was a walleye show. Did it on an inland lake in Wisconsin, and it was broadcast in 83. But anyway, after we filmed it, and a month later, I went out to Erie, and I happened to be fishing with Roach and Foffridge and his friend Tom Frisch, and another guy was one of the outdoor writers out there. I forget his name, Don something. And we were fishing around Peely, and Foffridge had just begun to do a little bit of trolling. He said, maybe we could try some trolling. He would go against the grain. And I reached into my bag and said, I got these things, these little planer boards I brought out. Let's put them on. So we put them on, and we trolled around Peely Island, and we caught walleyes and smallmouths. And Jim even caught about a 30-pound carp, great big carp. It was either Jim or Gary. I forget which one it was, on planer boards. And honestly, to my knowledge, that was the first time anybody put a small planer board in Lake Erie. And
yeah,
nowadays,
I miss those guys.
Nowadays, that is the way to fish out there. That's how everybody fishes. You don't see much weight forward spinners, but also, the environment changed. It used to be a lot more fertile water, and then after the zebra mussels arrived and they strained the water and made it clearer, then fish got spookier. It spooked away from your boat, and the trolling systems worked a lot better. So,
that's another thing. That's another thing the PWT showed, is that you couldn't fish too high. But our locals had no recollection of. High might have been 10, 12, 13 feet. And we learned real quick that high actually means 3-4 feet, maybe even higher. Like I remember Dave Hansen that I traveled with there from Bemidji, Minnesota. He took second in a tournament where him and Greg Hiroki were like neck and neck, and they blew everybody out of the water, and they were fishing crazy high.
Yeah,
right?
we took me down. I was at Lake Winnebago. Yeah, and Corky discovered it late on the first day, and he said, "If what I think is happening, he says I'm going to blow the field away." And it was just trolling this deep under the surface, out in the middle of this 18 by 22 or how big? No, Winnebago's like 30 miles by about 12, something like that, 7 to 12 miles wide. And just out in the middle, 2 foot down over the surface. And who knew? And also,
they were chasing white bass, weren't they?
There was in areas. He said, if I do this in areas where there's white bass, the walleyes are right underneath them, feeding on them. And that's how it turned out, and it worked. So found out that you control near the surface. We had tournaments like out of Lake Oahe where you control 30, 40 foot down with crankbaits over the tops of submerged standing timber and catch walleyes. And on Winnebago, we learned a lot of shallow stuff where you could pitch a little jig and a leech combo into 4 feet of water where there were cane beds and catch walleyes. You could pitch it into shallow weeds. You could fish little tiny spoons, little Cleo spoons over weeds and catch walleyes. Mike McClellan won the second tournament ever on Lake Oahe by pitching a jig and crawler up to the shorelines in Lake Oahe, right up to the shorelines, and catching 8-pound walleyes. So we not only learned the deep water systems, but it really opened the eyes to people that you could catch walleyes very, very shallow at times if the situation was correct. In other times it would be futile, but when the situation was correct, that's where they were. And you learn to keep an open mind. And traveling around to all these different locations around the country, you started seeing why the environment here is different than the environment over there. And the walleyes react this way here, but they react that way over there. And you started to really see the importance of being versatile. Because, if you were a Minnesota angler back in those days, you were versatile if you used a live bait rig and a jig. That was it. You were considered versatile if you did both. And nowadays, you had to do open water trolling. You had to fish deep water, shallow water, slip bobbers, crankbaits, a little bit of everything. And it all makes sense if you understand the habitat and what the walleyes are doing at that time of year.
Do you think that some of these things get broke because of tournaments, or is it sometimes just a situational thing? And like the white bass might be a good example, or the fact that the zebra mussels, when they cleaned it up, like that pattern went away. Like our fish, generally speaking, are not high anymore. Like it's quite the opposite. We're creating different delivery methods in order to efficiently and effectively fish deep,
right,
without getting junk and all the things that you get when you bottom fish or fish deeper. And you just wonder, like, because it's so hard. That's the thing with fishing, right? You're right on Monday, you're wrong on Tuesday. And as these conditions change, you can think that you know what you're doing. And then some other factor that we didn't either see or understand or even is maybe discovered at this point comes in. And I can remember you telling me way back, this is a long time ago, it's probably 15 years ago, you told me, you said, have you ever got onto a frog pattern for walleyes? And I thought you might have got into too much brown water or something back home there. But, you want to tell people about the frog pattern thing?
Well, yeah, in prairie lakes out in the Dakotas and in southern Minnesota, you've got frogs. When you get your first cold nights in September, the frogs start leaving the swamps and coming back into the lakes and piling into those shallow areas. And boy, if you go into the backs of some of these shallow bays with lily pads, you can catch walleyes that are feeding on frogs. Okay, and it's you would normally associate that with being a bass area. But no, that's the walleyes are in there heavy and they're feeding on frogs, or in some cases, salamanders leaving the swamps and coming and going into the water. So that's a legit pattern in those prairie lakes like that. So
you think about a night crawler, right? Whether it's live bait rigging or on a harness or whatever you want to call it, or tipping a jig, is, obviously anybody goes on a golf course or something after a rain or a parking lot, like crawlers don't like the water. And so they're not really natural, but yet, man, you fish a crawler harness without a crawler on it. Let me know how that day goes for you. You know, I'm always weird on what they will and won't eat.
Well, terrestrial things get washed into the water when there's a lot of rain or when there's a hurricane, obviously. And so the fish will be eating all kinds of interesting things after there's a big rainstorm.
You said earlier, like, that people now, I think a really good angler, in my opinion, it doesn't matter if you're a walleye fisherman or not, they pay attention to the things that matter. And they don't say, hey, I need a chrome blue crankbait or this or that. They're paying attention to the depth of this, all these other factors that matter more, that if you have the wrong color bait, you're still going to catch fish, right? The best bait, like to your point of view said, you know, especially with bass tournaments, I think this is even more prevalent. But when you have a bait that they come out and say, hey, the guy just won the Bassmaster Classic on this, and they sell a ton of them, just a shit pile of baits, and you're okay, great. But that doesn't really help the guy catch fish in most cases. I know there's probably been some exceptions with some things, but what do you think in your time covering, whether it's In-Fisherman stuff or the Walleye In-sider for the PWT or whatever, what are the patterns that have just maintained, that kind of opened your eyes but have stood the test of time? You know, everybody likes things that stand the test of time, not these flash in the pan things.
Well, obviously, if you fish up north and you fish natural lakes, the jigging and the live bait rigging will never ever go out of style. If you fish Lake Erie, they trolling with planer boards is never going to go out of style. That's going to, unless the environment changes way crazy different again. I don't foresee that happening. So in those prairie lakes in the Dakotas, they tend to be very fertile and green water in the summertime, and the fish can be quite shallow. You can catch walleyes even during the day in 3-4 feet of water. So the local pattern that it predominates is going to determine how you have to go about catching the fish, and you have to adapt to what the fish are doing and their location. You know, new things can come down the pike. You never know. Like in the last 10 years, the popularity of the jigging rapala has skyrocketed. And in some of the early tournament days, we had a few guys who used them on the Detroit River and a couple other places. They had a couple good finishes, but it wasn't
one. I remember that was back. Chief Pompano or Pampano, however you say his name. He won a jigger rap that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. Yeah, he did very well on the Detroit River with one. I remember that. But I know we started playing with that some years ago and found out it worked really good in open water. Not so much if you jigged it straight up and down, but if you cast it out and worked it back, or if you trolled it on a fairly long line and gave it snaps, it would go left, right, and it had such a erratic action to it that it would just trigger these savage strikes from everything. And you could cover water quickly, and you could troll between other people that were slowly live bait rigging and maybe only catching a few fish, and you come through them and you would be mowing the fish down, and they would think you were snagging, and they call the DNR conservation guy on you because you're obviously doing something illegal, and it wasn't. You were just fishing differently. So just about the time you think that there's nothing new, you're due for some kind of a revelation, and that certainly was one, fishing that style of lure like that.
Ironically, I had a call today from In-Fisherman, the new guard, and we were talking about, we're doing a show down the road and trying to set things up. And I imagine that with you guys, because the original In-Fish thing, I don't know that you guys invented it, but definitely were one of the first to kind of do that, where you had multiple segments. So you were in like 3 completely different places in the world, right? And doing totally different things.
We were actually pretty known for that. That was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, that's what I said. I don't know if anybody else, if I didn't know if you were the first ones, but I knew you had to be. That was kind of a neat deal. But anyway, talking to In-Fisherman today with a whole different guard and many changes in faces since then, we were talking about, the things that they've already shot and trying to get something different, showcasing some new presentations. And a few things that I was kind of telling them, I said, you do realize if you try to catch them on lead core or you try to catch them on this or whatever it may be, the chances are that day that's not what they want. And I imagine you ran into a lot of that when filming shows where you have them dialed in and then you go to film and they don't want to do that. And you may have already had 100 shows doing the other stuff, and you got to have some of those stories.
What I remember is in the very early days at In-Fish, we could go out and say we intended to do a walleye show or something, and we could go someplace. And a lot of times, if it went well, you could get an entire segment done in 4 hours. The fish really bit. And then sometimes you would get the opposite. You'd go somewhere for a couple of days, and what you thought would be happening wasn't working. And if we had the latitude to change, we changed to a different species, all of a sudden we'd come back with a really killer northern pike show. So because we were versatile multi-species anglers, we would realize when something wasn't working and what else could we do, and you make it happen, and sometimes you come away with some of your best stuff. Now, in today's world, there's a lot more sponsor pressure to catch them on particular things. Okay, that's what today.
Oh, don't I know that?
That's what today's TV stars, fishing stars, have to deal with. Okay. And as we got away from that initial way we used to do things, and it got to be like, here's a couple of lures, 3, 4, go out in the lake and do a show on that. And it was like, well, that doesn't leave me much room to experiment. We need you to take all your tackle boxes out and figure out what to go and just go make that happen. And sometimes you could do it, and sometimes even the stars come back empty-handed because the fish you could not get them to respond, or those lures were not efficient in the depth zones where the fish were at. So when you get pigeonholed into having to do things certain ways, you're risking not having a good catch. But when you can be versatile and dip into your bag of tricks, you can usually figure out something that's going to put fish in boat. It really pays to be versatile.
When I asked you earlier about, do you think that the fish are smarter now or what have you? And I just think about, like, on Lake Erie, I know what clarity of water in the spring and the summer and the fall that I need to be in for optimal catch rate. Right. Mm-hmm. And when it gets to be too dirty or too clean, I kind of, generally speaking, I know how that's going to change that. And then I can just remember fishing up in the Mississippi River with a bunch of those Minnesota boys, and you couldn't see 3 inches in the line. And back then, Roach was using that gold, or now it's lime, I think, line. You remember that, the old, and no leader. And he taught me to put a piece of split shot about 2 feet above the line, tiny little split shot, just so for netting, where the fish was actually at, because it was like chocolate milk, like a cup of coffee with about 10 scoops of milk in it or what have you, or creamer. And you go, man, how do these fish, they've adapted to that. And I kind of think of a private talk me and you had a while back where we're talking about, stocked fish and how that has caused them to evolve in some of the southern reservoirs, or out west even, that people don't realize are in some of these warm places, that there is no such thing as a normal or the same old walleye anymore, is there?
No, there really isn't. They've been stocked in so many different kinds of habitats and adapted to that local ecosystem, doing whatever it takes to prosper, that there's really no such thing as totally classic walleye behavior anymore. In southern reservoirs, they behave like this. In western reservoirs, they behave like that. In northern natural lakes, they behave like this. In the Great Lakes, they do a lot of suspending and roaming long distances. In rivers, they're relating to current. And in prairie lakes, it's a lot of shallow, dirty water habitat. And it's the same walleye, but they adapted to the different ecosystems. And, in Lake Winnebago, the walleyes don't spawn on rocks. They spawn in the Wolf River on flooded, they call it canary grass. It's flooded weed. And you read all the textbooks and it says walleye spawn on rocks. Well, maybe in a lot of places or most places, but not everywhere. Not everywhere. And they adapt to the local habitat. And so the better you understand the walleye's needs and how it can prosper and what the local lake, river, reservoir offers at that time of year and where the bait is, you can start putting together a game plan. And then when you think, I think the fish are going to be in these kinds of areas at these depths, then you go to your bag of tricks and you start picking out stuff that will go catch fish, as opposed to saying, aha, I got the magic lure because it just won the Bassmaster Classic. I'm going to go fish it there. That may not work. It may fail miserably. It could work, but it may be bad.
Well, I can remember old man Jim Foffrich. He worked with our DNR back in the day and proved that these walleyes were spawning in like Maumee Bay on basically the early zebra mussels, or that harder compacted where, at that point people didn't think that. Again, things that we take as common knowledge. Back then there wasn't that. But other places, what do you think is the most wacky pattern that you've heard about? That is not a one-off, but something that's maybe it's Lake A, B, or C or whatever, but just a wacky thing that as you covered in fish or the PWT through the years.
I'm trying to think. I don't know if I can say anything wacky. There were groundbreaking things like the jigging wrap, or when the planer boards and the open water trolling came along. I'm trying to think of anything that was particularly weird that only worked in one or two places, and nothing comes to mind. That's a good question, but I don't have an answer for you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, you just wonder if it's one of those things that unless you have a very specific set of circumstances on that body of water, that walleyes really are walleyes, even if they do adapt to different circumstances, like a spinner and a night crawler. Again, yeah, man, it's hard. You're hard pressed not to catch a walleye on a night crawler harness, or maybe it's a if you're in a little more of a finesse thing.
I'm thinking of this is the same body of water one day later. Okay, this story. I was with Al one time on the Rainy River where it flows into Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, and the river was normal clarity in the spring, and we were catching all kinds of walleyes just with a jig and minnow, very standard presentation. And then one of the feeder rivers went out and dumped its ice in the springtime, along with lots of mud, and the river just turned solid mud, and it went from great visibility to this much, and you couldn't see anything, and the jigging bite just disappeared. And we tried some normal stuff, drifting through holes, and didn't work at all. And then we went and we anchored in a series of rolling sandbars that had little depressions between them, and anchored. And there was a trick from the Mississippi River when you got dark water. You use a really big, heavy jig, like a 3/4 ounce or an ounce, and you put a big lizard tail and 2 minnows and rattles and spinners and whatever. And you'd make this big
kitchen sink
because they can't see it in that dingy water, but sit there and just bounce, bang, and pause a little bit, and bounce, and you got to anchor and you don't move. And son of a gun, there was walleyes that were there or that were passing through in waves once in a while. And that was one of those days where you pull the rabbit out of the hat, where you catch like 40, 50 really nice walleyes anchored in a spot while everybody else on the river is just struggling. And so, there are adaptations you can make. Sometimes you luck into them. Sometimes they're the product of a little bit of experimentation or some genius, but there's usually some way, if you think about it and you try hard enough, you can catch some fish. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy in the current conditions, but you can adapt and catch something. And that's for species.
When you kind of said that, I thought about a tactic where I think tournament fishermen learned was, and I'm sure maybe you guys took it back to Minnesota and tried it, but Detroit River guys, longer than me and you have been alive, have been hand lining. And then there's also whipping, as they call, is a different form of that too. But when that gets really muddy in the Detroit River, guys hand line, and essentially it's a different version of what you're saying. They're using crankbaits very close to bottom, but they don't hang up, and they're banging a 2, 3, 4 pound weight, whatever it may be, banging the bottom with that, with no rod and reel.
The first time I saw that was at the mouth of the Detroit River where it hit Erie, and there was 100 boats jigging, drifting, and catching hardly anything. And I watched a couple guys in a little tiny boat hand lining work their way through those packs of boats, and they were just smacking the good sized walleyes and big walleyes. one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And your first instinct, again, it's like, they got to be doing something illegal. They must be snagging or something. It wasn't. They were making all of this noise. They were moving very slowly. The lures were wobbling in the fish's face for an extended period. And the combination of things worked to trigger strikes in that particular environment. And I know I've done it there. I learned I had to try it. And it's effective when the water is really, really dirty. Doesn't make it my favorite way to want to fish, holding a wire with a 2 or 3 pound weight on it, banging the bottom. But, you know, guys in the professional walleye trail, they took that concept and they used that in other places. They used either the hand line or else they used a very short rod with wire and heavy weight on there and tried basically the same thing. And they caught fish from time to time doing that. They were willing to experiment and be versatile and try something different in the face of adversity. And sometimes that stuff works.
Yeah, I just wonder sometimes if we're trying to get too fancy and we just need to get back to basics, kind of like those basketball guys that can do all kinds of aerial 360 dunks, but they can't hit a free throw. You know, do you think that we're like that with walleye fishing a little bit? We're so worried about aqua-view cameras and mega live sonar and all that we're just not doing the basics.
It's gotten to be very, very technical, very scientific, very machine oriented. And I miss the days when things were a lot simpler. Because, you know, back in the day, you weren't as efficient of an angler. You just didn't have the tools or the understanding at your hands. But there was a mystery and there was a majesty to what you were doing. And the early writings of Bill Binkelman in Fishing News magazine, it was published out of the Milwaukee area, a tabloid. It had some great allure to what was happening. And you were at the search for this giant bass, and you were going to tease them with 4-pound line, and it was like a story in itself. It involved the mystery of understanding the underwater world, and we couldn't see it. We barely had depth finders. A lot of it was in your imagination, trying to form a mental picture of what's going on down there, and it was always mysterious and exciting when you solve the mystery. And nowadays, with all the sophisticated electronics we have, now you're actually almost seeing everything that's going on down there. And it takes a lot of the mystery out of it and makes it much more of a mechanical approach. And I miss that because, you know, fishing with family and friends and different generations and teaching the generation that's coming up, that's all a part of what angling is for the American angler. It always has been. And we don't want it to just become, you know, I guess the basketball equivalent today would be a bunch of 3-point shots, you know, and it didn't used to be that way. Bill Russell used to play a heck of a defense and keep the ball. And that was a big part of what was going on. And it wasn't about people launching the ball from half court. You know, times have changed.
I think we might be going that direction a little bit. And you've definitely had a few more sunrises in the boat than I have. But when I just look back and I think about I almost think literally like back even when I was fishing tournaments early in my career, and I was winning a lot and doing really well. And I just thought, thinking back now at those times, like, how the hell did I even catch fish? You know, you have a wider palette to look at from that. Don't you look back at some of the things, like you said, no electronics, using milk jugs to mark drop-offs and feel weeds, and now we have this, and you just wonder, it's like, man, I can't imagine if me would be back here 20 years ago at how many fish I could have caught that day when I thought I was doing good.
Yeah. So. I remember one championship at Saginaw Bay with the PWT, and the guys had been marking fish on their early GPSs out in Saginaw Bay, like 12 miles out. And they went out on the first day of the tournament after practice, and there was an actual satellite malfunction. The signal, I don't know what it was, but it's like there was like 41 guys out there, and 38 of them had no GPS. And a couple of guys with Loran C's or something found their ways back. A lot of people were panicking, didn't know what to do. A few people who were some of the old dogs said, well, I remember when I came out of the river mouth in practice, I went at a certain course and I went at this speed for so many minutes, and they did it again and then put themselves back in the area where they had been catching fish. So some of those guys were able to adapt better. Other people just totally panicked, and they became too reliant on the electronics. And so there's definitely rationale with understanding how to do things the old-fashioned way. And
That's a good one.
I will say this nowadays. I mean, I have access to all different kinds of fishing styles. One of the things I really do enjoy is, I know when I got away from the PWT and all of the trolling for days and days and days, I'd come home and I could fly fish for panfish or for bass. And it was very one-on-one.
No buggy whip.
Very visual, very visual. There was no electronics involved, and it was back to the basics, back to more to what it was like in my childhood, just man versus fish, as opposed to having all the sophisticated stuff in between. And there's definitely a part of that, and we should never let all of that go. That's still got to remain a part of angling for it to be the sport that it is.
I think that I'm not a purist in the sport from the standpoint, fish make us look too stupid too often. I don't care who you are. If you're Al Lindner or you're Kevin Van Dam or whatever, like if you think you really have fishing figured out, you, my friend, are the fool. You know, there's just too many variables with fish and the weather and us and everything else. And I look at like when you like guys that are good shooters, like I've got a good friend of mine who's an amazing sporting clay shooter, right? And now they're using 20 gauge or 16 gauges or something to basically make it more interesting, more sporting, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And with fishing, I just can't. Can you ever see that really happening? I mean, like purposely having tournaments with no sonar. I've heard people mention things like that. And
one rod, take one rod and one lure. So if you lose your lure, you're out of luck.
Minnesota rules.
Yeah, you got to pick your lure in advance. If the fish breaks it off, you're done.
Well, and they do have those too, Dave. You know, they've got like Spro has the big bass, whatever they call it, challenge where you can only use a Spro frog. Like that's all you can use. There's a few tournaments like that, but I guess in a roundabout way, I don't think me and you have even talked about this, but I'm working on a project boat. I bought an old Ranger tiller, 90 horse, 18 footer, and I'm totally gutting it and restoring it. And for doing some different smaller stuff and some little monkeying around that I'm not going to tell everybody exactly what for, but you know, I kind of in a weird way of reminiscing of thinking about those days when you fished in the small boats and you did things different. It's kind of fun, you know, kind of kicking that back when things weren't 400 horses like I have on my daily boat.
There's all different styles of fishing. And in the walleye world, we tend to think of it now as the big boats, go fast, open water trolling, electronics, sophistication. But there's all different kinds of fishing, different species, different bodies of water, sizes of bodies of water, times of the year, all these different tactics that we can use, and they all have a time and place, and they all have a kind of a magic of their own. And you know, the better you match what you're doing to the situation where the fish are and what they are doing, the more fish you're going to catch. And you can choose to fish different styles. You may not want to fish a particular way. Like you may not want to troll multiple lines. You may sacrifice some efficiency, but you may have, you know, more of a sense of accomplishment and feeling the strike if you're casting and jigging or something like that. It's a different way to fish, and you get more pleasure out of it. Thing is, with fishing, you can do whatever you want. You can take it to whatever degree you want. You can sit on the bank with a stick and a line and a sinker and a chunk of bait and just sit there, or you can go aggressively and chase them down with electronics and everything in between.
I'm still result oriented. You know, I can remember guys saying, you know, that I'd rather see an empty, and this was like back in the Fofferage days with those charter captains, they'd say, I'd rather see a white in the bottom of my cooler than, you know, pick up a trolling rod or whatever it may be. And which I think is a little foolish, but I understand the whole, what you just said about, you know, doing it the way you want to do it, feeling the bite or doing that. But I think ultimately I'm still success oriented, whatever that means, whatever we got to do within reason.
I can think of a story, and I'll pick on Al. I finally am going to pick on Al a little bit. It was at Scott Lake in Saskatchewan, way up north, and I was fly fishing and catching pike, and Al doesn't fly fish. He just doesn't do it.
He's too fast for that.
He's too fast. He's too fast for it. He uses other stuff. He figures he can be more efficient. And also, he doesn't have any fly fishing sponsors. So that never evolved into In-Fisherman's television coverage. Maybe it's different nowadays.
Didn't you? Yeah, Larry Dahlberg was doing that for a hot minute with you guys.
Well, he
had
did
him on
for
too.
a little bit, but there were no sponsors, and so they never really wanted to pursue it. But anyway, I was in a boat behind Al, fishing through the water after he had fished through one particular day, and
I bet this is going to chap his ass.
And every once in a while, I just see his head spin around because he could hear my fly line tighten up and kind of sing in the wind, like because I'd have another 18 to 20 pound northern on behind him, and he'd almost snap his neck. He'd turn around and look back. You got another one? I said, yeah. You want a fly rod? No, I can catch him on what it is. And that night, we got back together, and he said, you know what? If you'd have caught one more, I was going to jump under your boat and take that rod away from you. So, yeah.
Al is still competitive. I know somebody that was with him during a charity thing, and he's casting over their head. And I mean, but that's, I think, why he's Al, right? I mean, you have to have that competitive fire.
Yeah, he really does have it. It's his personality, and he wants to catch them all and catch them now is what he wants. And he told Dan Sir and I one time, he says, you guys, you go out for the experience. He says, you'll talk about how the birds were singing and the sunrise was beautiful and all that kind of stuff. And it was pleasant to be out and you enjoyed each other's company. But if you didn't catch a bunch of fish, it was a failure. I go out there and I want to catch the most and the biggest as fast as I can. And that's just his personality. That's how he.
I feel like we would be cheating our listeners because they love stories, and you were just you have a good way of not only telling stories, but you've lived long enough and done enough to acquire quite a few. And when you said Dan Sura, another one of the kind of original guard there in fish, I remember a story about him jumping in the Mississippi River. Do you remember that?
It wasn't quite jumping. We went out in October to musky fish, and it was cold. We were all dressed up in heavy gear, clothing, and I was in the back with the tiller motor driving into a channel around an island, and it was a good place to fish. And he was going to put the trolling motor in over the bow. And as we're pulling in, I said, now I'm going to coast in here, and I'm going to try not to hit this stump that's in the sandbar right in front of the little cove here. And so just as he's leaning, he pulls the motor up, and you can picture it leaning over, pushing the motor in, and just he gets
been there.
It was perfect. It dropped in, and we coasted in, and we hit that stump, and the boat just stopped. And Dan was leaning forward, and just in that motion, he just did like Superman. And when he hit the water, he went right over the nose of the boat, hit the water. He was flat above the water for several feet, and just dropped in. And it was funny. I mean, I laughed. He didn't necessarily laugh too much, but I give him credit. I fished him out. And he stayed out in there and fished in October in the cold for half a day, being totally soaked like that. And he finally said, I give up. I just can't do it anymore. But every once in a while, something weird like that will happen. Like this with a buddy of mine. This was when I was still in college. We went up to Canadian Lake and went musky fishing, and I didn't have any money for a fancy rod. I bought a little $5 pistol grip, heavy duty pistol grip to fish with musky lures. So you can only hold it like this. It was not ideal, but we caught some fish, did fine. And the last day we were there, I went to cast it, and the rod broke off, and I'm sitting there with the handle in my hand. Now the rest of it could go anywhere, right? And it turns around with the reel end first, like a javelin, and it goes right up to the front of the boat, and it drills my buddy right in the back of his head. It's like I took that reel and I threw it as hard as I could and hit him in the back of the head 10 feet away. And he just dropped to his knees and he almost went unconscious. And we were the guide, and the guide and I looked at each other and we just busted out laughing, and we just couldn't stop for like a half hour. My friend didn't see the humor in it, but weird stuff happens. And there's always, you fish long enough, stuff like that is going to happen. It's funny stuff.
That's a fact. I mean, tell me a good one from like the Put-in-Bay tournaments, because I know that when the In-Fisherman was actually on Put-in-Bay Island, and I think a lot of that was because of probably tourism, but also the guys didn't have big enough boats maybe to run all the way out there, and they could kind of hide out. But there had to be some shenanigans and some good stuff that came out of that.
One of the first day I got to Put-in-Bay, this is not the boats, but Chief Mark Levitch and I we were staff, so we were going to stay in some lodging they provided, which they usually used for people who work at the bars and restaurants. But it was early in the season; it was empty. So we walk upstairs, and everything is very dark because there's nobody staying in there at the time. And we walk up the stairs, second floor, find a room, go inside, and I reach over and touch the light switch, and I flip the light switch. And outside the window, there's this tremendous explosion and sparks and fire. Boom, like that. And I happened to be looking out the window, and every light on the entire island at Put-in-Bay went out. Every light in the entire island. And I looked over at Chief, and we're in the dark, My hand is still on the light switch. And
what did you do, Dave?
I go, test the light switch a few times. Like I had thrown the switch and knocked out the entire South Bass Island. It turned out lightning had just at that very moment hit a transformer outside the room.
Can you imagine in those early years if you had a GoPro or everybody would have had cell phone cameras like they do, some of the things that would have been captured?
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that went on. Lots of funny stuff.
You're from the Chicago area. Al and those guys were from the Chicago area. Didn't you have? I remember one of our buddies talking about a Super Bowl celebration. That had to be what, in the 80s?
85 Bears. Yeah, Al was
the Bears.
And Sura was there, and a bunch of our friends, Tom Newstrom, Jan Eggers. The Foffrishes were there. Jimmy
Really?
and Senior were there at the Chicago Sports Show. Jerry Jr. was there. And we were watching at the game, the Super Bowl game after the sports show. We had done some seminars and the show was over. The Hyatt Regency was right next door. And we were watching the game. And of course, the Bears won big over the Patriots, 46-10, I think it was. And there was a tremendous celebration, as you can expect in Chicago afterwards. And we had a conga line of like 40 people marching around over the hotel, up and down over the furniture. Everybody's chanting and yelling and screaming. And Tony Dean, fishing personality at the time, got out of the elevator and saw this, and he kind of panicked. He said, "What's going on?" Instantly, everybody in this line goes, "Tony, Tony, Tony," and he says, "Where's Al?" And then everybody, I don't know how they did it, everybody in the line instantly started going, "Al who? Al who? Al who?" Now, Al had been there earlier in the day, but he left. He left early. He wasn't into the game, so he was driving back to Minnesota already.
Yeah, that's not Al's scene for sure.
No. Anyway, we got this whole hotel lobby and all these people chanting, "Al who? Al who? Al who?" So for a year after that, when we would talk amongst ourselves, and the subject of Al came up, we would say, "Al who? Al who? Al." And one time we were out fishing a lake in the Brainerd area with a friend of ours, a couple different boats, and Al was in the other boat. And the one guy could do a pretty good loon call. So he was out there going, "Al who? Al who? Al who?" And Al would look around. I could see him in the other boat. He'd look around. It's like, what's going on, Al? We would pick on him once in a while. And you would never see that on television, of course. But he was one of the guys. And nobody ever picked on him, so we had to. Somebody had to do it.
Absolutely. We could definitely do stories forever, but give me one more story that is in your repertoire, because I imagine you could be like a Hemingway here of the fishing stories.
I've got one which very few people have ever heard, and it did not involve Al or Ron, but I was on a far north Canadian fishing trip with Skip James, who was our TV guy, TV shooter, and his brother Don came, and we flew up into Saskatchewan to Reindeer Lake, and we just had one of the new early trolling motors from Shakespeare, and Skip wanted to bring it. I said, "You can't bring that on the plane. You'd have to bring a battery. You can't bring that on a plane." He said, "Don't worry about it." He said, they want us to go up there and film. So we drive to Winnipeg. We fly up to, I don't remember if it's Flin Flon or whatever it was, some place far up there, and get the jet. It's a 727. I mean, it's a big jet. And we get off, and it's taken forever to get our luggage off the plane. And finally, we see people running out, and they're wearing like plastic hazmat suits, running in there, pulling stuff out of the plane. And I'm going, oh no, I know what it is. It's the battery. And the airport manager comes running in and says, "Where's Don James?" This is Skip's brother. Don James. I said, "Is there a problem?" He said, "Are you Don?" I said, No. Don's over there. He's over there at the payphone telling his wife he's in Canada and everything is fine. He said, he put a battery on the plane and it exploded.
Oh,
I said, exploded. And we've got battery acid in all of the wiring and the pneumatic. And oh man, he says, "You guys stay right there." And he ran back out again. And we're sitting there for a while wondering what's going to happen to us. We're going to jail, And then they start bringing some of the luggage out, and some of the luggage is dissolving. Got battery acid. So and the poor guy with the manager, he's running around, and he said, "Look, we're with this part of this group. We got to get on float planes and go to Reindeer Lake. You guys stay there, but we're holding everything up, and we got to come back through here on the way out. So you'll get us. How about you get us then?" And he had so much to do. He said, "All right, go." So we went in. We were going in the Reindeer Lake for 4 days, and we thought, well, we had the option to stay a couple of extra days. Let's do it. We're going to stay out of jail for 2 more days. And when we fly out, we're expecting them to meet us, and there's nobody in the little airport. Nobody there. There's no police, no nothing. So they said, well, okay, they'll probably be down in Winnipeg. We fly down on the jet to Winnipeg, and there's nobody there. Okay, well, let's drive back across the border into the United States, and we'll negotiate from home. And we did that. And a couple of days later, the vice president of the airline, Pacific Western Airline, called our office and, "How did you guys get out of there? We had every flight watched out of Winnipeg." He said, "Well, we didn't fly out of Winnipeg. We drove." And the guy went, "Oh, I never thought of that." He says, "We had to ground that jet for a whole cycle back and forth." He said, and Al was kind of laughing about it. He wasn't involved, but he was laughing until he heard that it was like $40,000 in downtime on the flight, which was a lot of money in those days. This is
I was going to say, imagine what that number would be today.
Yeah, old time dollars. This is old time dollars. He said, we're gonna figure this out, So then we heard nothing for a while, and then finally the guy cooled off, and on his end, and he figured, well, we were back in the States. They couldn't do anything to us. They couldn't grab us. And we actually made kind of an honest mistake. Although if you look at the ticket, on the back of the ticket, the first thing it says is, "Thou shalt not put explosives, corrosives, poisons, stuff like that on the airplane." Well, we pled dumb, and the guy finally said, "All right," he said, "We're just going to let it go. We're going to leave it go, but you guys are never welcome on our airline again." So this was long before the no-fly list and terrorist stuff. And had that happened today, we'd still be sitting in a Canadian jail someplace.
You were probably on a clipboard there for a few years.
Yeah, and I might still be in the database someplace. I don't know, but we just blame it on Don James, who had nothing to do with it to begin with. So, yeah, there was often things that happened behind the scenes that the public never knew about, and some of them were darn funny. That one was kind of funny, but also was kind of serious at the time. But there was a lot of fun and a lot of fish caught over the years, and a lot of good friends, and I learned a lot of fishing from a lot of very good anglers that I got to watch or fish with over the years, and it was a pretty magical time.
Definitely. Did you know? I guess here's my last question for you. Did you at that time really know how special it was?
Probably didn't totally understand, because we were too enmeshed in it, and it was a lifestyle, an absolute lifestyle. But looking back and at the track record of everything that we did, yeah, it was pretty darn amazing. Pretty darn amazing. It was very fortunate. It was like Ronald said, it was like being Forrest Gump. He happened to be there when all this stuff happened. We were there. We were there when a lot of stuff happened. Okay, we just happened to be in the crossroads, maybe because we anticipated things that were happening, or we were helping to discover things. But a number of times we were there when the magic happened. Made for a pretty interesting career.
Definitely very cool. Well, I can't thank you enough for giving us not only your time today, but all the help that you've done for me through the years. One of my first articles was for In-Fisherman in my teens, thanks to you, that I co-authored it, if you remember, with old Jimmy Fofferich Jr., I think it was.
Well, you had a very progressive looking view on working open water trolling and working for walleyes, and you were a good communicator, and that is something that's a good tip for people wanting to get in the industry. They say, well, I love to fish. Well, you also have to be a very, very good communicator to do either writing or speaking or television or working with outdoor writers or doing in-store promotions. You have to be able to get the point across, talk about products, talk about fishing. It's not just about going out and catching fish. There's a whole lot more to a career in the industry that is necessary to make it happen. And you were one of the really good ones. And even though you were just a very young guy at the time, we could see the potential there. And there was a time I used to be the kid. People call me the kid. And at that time, calling you the kid, neither of us are kids anymore.
They did. No, we're not. No, we've seen a few. That's been a long time. That's 25 plus years, I guess, all said and done. But
there are new kids coming up.
There are. It's the changing of the guard, just like any other sport would be. But thanks again, Dave, for giving us your time. A true legend of the sport and one of the original guys with In-Fisherman. Dave Csanda, thanks for joining us on the Bigwater podcast. Make sure that you tune in to YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all that good stuff. We've got Bigwater Fishing. Producer dude, how many things am I forgetting? We on Stitcher, Spotify, Google, Apple. We're on everything. Just go to bigwaterfishing.com if you can't find us. It's Bigwater Fishing. We're everywhere but the jail cells as of now. So check us out, podcast, all that good stuff. We even got some videos dropping, I think, next week, don't we, producer dude?
We do. Yep.
Until the next episode, Dave, thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Ross. We'll see you. Bye-bye.